Sometimes we forget why we're here. It's easy to fall off track. These help us remember.
These battle scars don't look like
Sometimes we
they're
forget why we're
fading.
here.
Don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battles.
Growing up I had a dream, something no one else could see. Tell me what it means when your faith is falling beneath your knees and you can't breathe. Everything you see reminds you of what you're not or something you won't be. You gotta take what you're given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe in the business. Not because they wanna do it, just because they heard it pays. And who the fuck wants to be poor knowing that's how we've been raised? Society is getting heavy, I can feel the weight. The pressure of success is like 100 million pounds of shame. And that's the reason I'm staying up late, trying to find a way to escape the stereotypes this day and age is making me feel like the only way I'll be happy is getting signed to a label and making money through rapping. I wanna share my emotion because this world is attacking the very principle of life that lets the people be happy. If you don't have a reason to breathe, why even live? These battle scars are impressions of everything that it is.
Scars don't look like they're fading. Don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battle scars don't look like they're fading. Don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battles.
Now, if I had a voice that reached 100 million people, I'd tell them there's a reason that we're all created equal. Cause some decide to be great and some decide a sequel to an average person's life is simply what they want to be. So you make your decision, all I know is what I'm given. Won't define the life I lead or the way I dwell in existence. I've seen a greater image on the walls of where I'm living, and the words twisted and scripted remind me of something written. Faith is a gift that is given down to the people. If one believes it, one receives it. It's given if it is needed. Don't ever think you're trapped in a life that you never wanted. Your options are infinite, that's some mathematical logic. I'm not saying I'm a prophet, I'm speaking for what it's worth. These lyrics define my prayers and these battle scars on my church. Not saying I'm a prophet, I'm speaking for what it's worth. These lyrics define my prayers, these battle scars on my church.
Scars don't look like they're fading. Don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battle scars don't look like they're fading. Don't look like they're ever gone away. They ain't never gonna change. These battles.
Well, hello everyone. How are you doing? I hope you are having an awesome night. Let's get the YouTuber stuff out of the way. Just had a super bizarre and still in the middle of having a super bizarre exchange on Twitter where apparently just disagreeing with somebody is now bullying. Oh boy, listen, if you're a public figure, you're going to have people who disagree with you. That's just the way it is. Now, people disagree with you with like really disgusting insults or something like that, then yeah, they're probably bullying you. But if they just make a statement of disagreement, that's not bullying, that's Twitter. Okay, let's do the YouTuber stuff. You can speaking of Twitter, you can follow me on Twitter. I am Karen Ann Harlos there. And I'll try not to bully you by my disagreement. Wow, I am like, just like, okay. Apparently, if disagreement's not allowed, I'm in big trouble. And also, please subscribe to the channel. I would truly, truly appreciate it. It does help the algorithm. And you can give me a Christmas gift by becoming a patron. Actually, it's a patron at Patreon, I think is actually the right way to say it. But you guys know. And hello, everyone. Hello, Frank. Hello, Steve. Hello, Andrew. So, patreon.com/Pink Flame of Liberty. I would really, really appreciate it. I would like 2024 to be a year of more videos and more diverse videos. Obviously, I'll keep doing the historical items, but I think I am going to veer a little bit more into commentary, but who knows? It'll be whatever strikes my fancy, you know. That's just kind of how I roll. Okay. Today's topic, it's so vast in a way that I don't even know how to approach it. I could tell you how I started approaching it. No, you guys can never say that I don't kill trees, for one thing, but that I don't do my research. This right here is the Colorado Supreme Court decision. No, I did not read the whole thing. I am going to eventually read the whole thing, but I stuck to the one thing that I'm trying to narrowly focus on, and this will probably be multiple shows. And I also printed out the article, a really good summary article from the, I do not know how to pronounce this, Volca conspiracy. However you pronounce it, it's a legal commentary blog that I generally enjoy, even if I don't always agree with it. And I'm not sure, if you want to know if I've come to a conclusion on this question, I have not, by the way. I'll not going to bury the lead. I'll tell you right up front that this is a question that I am exploring. But in this blog, he mentioned a New York University Journal of Law and Liberty article that he wrote. And I did read this whole thing because it's right on the question I want to deal with. So I'd really encourage you to read this, the title of it, and I could probably find the link for you, but we're going to be going through this in detail. Is the President an officer of the United States for purposes of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment? I can tell you this has been a roller coaster for me because I started out this research agreeing with Colorado without knowing why. Just instinctually, I agreed with them. And let me back up a little bit here. What got me interested in this question, because y'all might be going, you're an anarchist who doesn't even hold to the Constitution, so why are you even interested in this really specialized constitutional question? I don't know, because it kind of reminds me of parliamentary stuff and bylaws. Maybe that's why. But more importantly, I was having just like flashbacks to the whole, did Trump violate, with bringing home the documents? Was he able to unilaterally declassify them as president? And something I found is people had these strong opinions on the issues involved in that, predetermined. If you were a Trump person, you basically, no matter what anyone said, you were just convinced that he had declassified them when he was president. I'm going to tell you, he did not declassify them when he was president. That's just my opinion. As an outside libertarian that just doesn't even care about that. And if you were on the other side, you would not hear any arguments to the contrary. It was just Orange Man bad. He's in violation of whatever we can find him in violation of. And I'm finding the same thing here. So I hear so many people on the right just repeating the talking point that he's not an officer of the United States. And if you ask why, they regurgitate a couple points they heard, but very few people delved into it deeply. And the opposite thing on the left, it's the same thing. So I decided, you want to know what? On this narrow question, I'm really interested in it. So I want to delve into it deeply. So something I wanted to bring up. So this Volkov, or however you pronounce it, article, and remember, all super chats matter because this is definitely some specialized content here. This article summarizes this. It's not really like a law review. It's a law journal, I guess, article. And this article was written when the impeachment hearings were going on. So it wasn't written presently in light of the Colorado Supreme Court controversy. So it was written a bit ago. But what I would like to go over or go through is this paper. Because there's some really, really good things in here. And again, I really recommend everyone read this. And one thing also I wanted to say, I haven't listened to any other YouTube commentators on this topic. I wanted to come to my own opinion. I saw that Dave Smith had a show, maybe not on this precise subtopic, but on the issue of the Colorado Supreme Court decision in general. I have not listened to that yet. I have avoided most other commentary because I wanted to approach it on virgin soil, as it were. Okay, as best as you can. Now, what is interesting here, if we go to the second page of this, what I really liked is how this broke it down. I know you really can't read it on the screen, but I wanted to show you what pages I was at. Is we're dealing with, again, the 14th Amendment, Section 3, which reads, no person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer in any state to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. But Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. I like the way they broke it down, and you can see it on the screen. They put little numbers here. So that first sentence, there's a little number 3 next to it, but let's go to the second part that's in bold, because that's what we're going to deal with. And you notice they have a little 1 by it, because they broke this section down into its elements. So 1 is the jurisdictional element. So it says what positions are subject to this Section 3. If the jurisdictional element is not met, the rest of it is irrelevant. So that's why I'm interested in this question. I had so many people say to me on Twitter, oh, you should just be talking about whether or not he engaged in insurrection. That's legally not how you look at things. Legally, when you look at things, you first have to look at the jurisdictional element. You can't file something in a court if that court doesn't have jurisdiction over you. The jurisdictional question is paramount. If you've ever looked at the rules of civil procedure, either federal or state rules of civil procedure, even appellate procedure, one of the first things you have to put in your initial pleading is an assertion that the court has jurisdiction over usually it's subject matter jurisdiction, but there could be, different types of jurisdiction over your case. It doesn't matter how good your case is if it doesn't apply, if there's no jurisdiction. I know that doesn't track entirely here, but it gives you conceptually what I'm talking about. So first, which is in bold here, is the jurisdictional element. And that's all I'm going to, after I go over with the different elements here, we're just going to focus entirely on the jurisdictional element. Number 2, which is the italicized language up there, is the offense element. So it defines the conduct that is at the heart of this. 3 is the punishment, the disqualification element. It'll be if jurisdiction is met and the person did the thing, then 3rd, this is what applies to that person. And then number 4 is like an amnesty provision, which I'm not going to ever probably deal with at all, because that's pretty irrelevant here. Now, I'm just looking at comments a little bit, and I see Zeus on Twitch had said, and I do want to stick this on screen, this is very much a conversation, because I'm not sure. I am so willing to hear other points of view. So Zeus had said, and happy Christmas to you as well. It doesn't say Trump can't run in Colorado. And there's a show called Liberal Hive Mind that I watch, but he gets a lot of things wrong. And one thing he gets wrong is he was acting as if this Colorado Supreme Court decision had anything to do with the general election, and it doesn't. It could have implications to that, but this is about keeping Trump off the primary ballot in Colorado, not the general election ballot. So, of course, the GOP in Colorado, and I live in Colorado, by the way, Zeus, or anyone listening who doesn't know, which is why it's of specific interest to me. So the Colorado GOP, of course, just said, well, we're going to forego the primary. And yes, they can do that. Colorado used to be a caucus state. And major political parties can opt out of the primary. They got to amend their bylaws by a certain vote threshold, but they can opt out of the primary. Obviously, I care about the Libertarian Party, and Colorado is a minor party. We have it in our bylaws. There's a little bit of a different process, but we also opt out of the primary. There are certain narrow circumstances in which we're forced into a primary, but it's pretty rare, even though it did happen last time. It is instead pretty rare. So let's make it clear that this is talking about the Colorado primary. Okay, so what's very interesting about this part of the Constitution, and it's the way the Colorado Supreme Court took it, and I'll tell you, it's how I originally took it, whatever. I'm not even going to criticize my own English here. It says a person can't hold office if they previously, I am condensing it, if they previously took an oath as an officer. And I think what our instinct is to say, well, who holds office? Officers hold office. And we're viewing these two terms as equivalent. So, holding any office in the first sentence, we are kind of making a lot of us, and the argument saying that the Colorado Supreme Court was right, is making holding any office equivalent to officer of the United States. And I don't think that's unreasonable. But is that in fact what was intended when this was written? So some of the background of the 14th Amendment, I have a lot of watchers from out of the country, so I'm sorry if this is a bit remedial for those who are in this country, but this is one of the Reconstruction Amendments. So this was written right after the Civil War. And it was intended to keep certain Confederates or people that supported the Confederacy from holding federal office. That's the background of it. This should go to tell you, like, why you shouldn't be writing amendments for these specific use case situations. Like, this was a mistake. This part here was a mistake. And now we're what's funny, but not haha funny, just isn't it ironic, Alanis Morissette kind of funny, is all this crap that's trying to be pulled to keep Trump off the ballot. As you know, I've never voted for Trump and I never would. So this isn't about caring about Trump at all. Is a Reconstruction Amendment might actually be what sets off the next civil war in this country. Isn't that ironic? And I was also having this philosophical conversation. We'll go to the insurrection thing for a minute, which isn't going to be the primary topic here. Whether or not you're a patriot or an insurrectionist depends upon who wins the argument, doesn't it? How do you think England felt about the United States? You know, the people over here, patriots, because what, we won? We were insurrectionists to England. So I guess just as an American, I find it somewhat ironic, hypocritical, and highly offensive to have such a concentration on this idea of insurrection bad in our Constitution when we were literally founded on insurrectionists. Our country was founded by treasonous insurrectionists. That is just a fact. And if freedom doesn't entail, and I think the Declaration of Independence says you do have the freedom actually to rebel against your government. That's one of the inalienable rights that you have. So what the Declaration of Independence gives, the Constitution tries to take away. So I always find the whole concept of treason, insurrection, and all of that just highly, highly offensive. That's me. That could just be my anarchist little self, but just wanted to say that. Okay, so we talked about breaking down this amendment into its element. So the authors here say the phrase office under the United States in the disqualification element, which we're not dealing with, is distinguishable from the phrase officer of the United States in the jurisdictional element. So that's the assertion that they are making. So the jurisdictional element applies to exactly 4 defined categories of state and federal position. So in order for this part of the Constitution to have jurisdiction over you, you have to be part of these 4 defined categories, which isn't every elected office in the country, by the way. What's so interesting is that this did not prohibit all people holding Confederate elected office that may have previously sworn an oath to the Constitution prior to the Civil War from holding office. I used to think that any person, forget about whether they ever swore an oath before, and I think this is a common misunderstanding. I used to think that any person who was found guilty of insurrection of any sort was disqualified from any kind of office whatsoever, ever. I just thought that. That, in fact, is not the case. At least not pursuant to this, it's not. There can be state laws and things like that, but not pursuant to this provision of the Constitution. It applies only to these 4 categories. And what's interesting about President Trump is he's a single use case here, because normally these broad categories would catch any president because most presidents served in office before, but Trump is an anomaly. He hadn't served in any kind of office before. So was someone like him just not anticipated by the framers of this? Perhaps, but our rights, and I'm using rights in the way a constitutionalist would. You know, I don't think the Constitution gives us rights. Don't come at me. I need to use constitutional language here, even though, God, I need more to drink the more time I say the word Constitution. But anyway, the constitutional rights can't be interpreted by, oh, well, they made an oopsie, so we're going to add it in here because we know that they would have if they realized their mistake. No, this is kind of, okay, you fucked up. Now you got to live with it. If they didn't anticipate someone falling into the category, such as Trump, being a former president who held none of these other specified categories before, too bad, so sad, sucks to be you. You shouldn't have fucked up when you wrote it. I do think that potentially they screwed up, that they meant to include it, but quite expressly by their language, they did not. And if this is some kind of like contract between the government and the people, well, it's by its terms. And if you messed up, you messed up. And they had all kinds of review committees. I'm finding out in here, they had a style committee. Hey, Mike Seebeck, if you're watching this, they had a style committee. And I disagree with some of the conclusions made by the style committee, by the way. And we'll learn the name of the other committee. But they had like 2 committees go over this. So this isn't just like 2 guys in a bar like jotting something out. They had plenty of opportunity to make sure they said what they meant and meant what they said. And if somehow an oopsie got in there, too bad. It's like I often say with state parties. You're allowed to have bad bylaws. I have read some bylaws multiple times, and if Andrew Chatterton's still in here, he knows I've used this term quite a bit. Well, That's an unfortunate bylaw. Mike, I was saying they had a style committee for writing portions of the Constitution. It was really interesting. We're going to get into that. So you're allowed to have unfortunate provisions. I use the phrase unfortunate bylaws all the time, and Michigan had a series of very unfortunate bylaws. And by the way, Mike, I found some more problems in the Colorado bylaws. Why is it every time I read, like, we work on it so hard and there are still issues? That's just the way it is. There are some things that need to be amended in Colorado, by the way. I'm not going to say what they are because I'm not allowed bad actors to exploit things that I just noticed. And plus, now I want to get them running to go, like, it's very obscure. People probably wouldn't find it. Anyway. Let's continue. So, Section 3, jurisdictional element applies to exactly 4 defined categories of state and federal position. President Trump clearly does not fit into 3 of these. So he never swore an oath as a member of Congress. He was never a member of any state legislature, nor was he an executive or judicial officer of any state. So we know the first 3 he definitely does not fall into. Indeed, it says here, Trump was the only president in American history to have never held prior state, federal, civilian, or military public office. Okay. If this jurisdictional element applies to him, it can only apply to him under one category. Unlike all prior presidents that would have already been, you never even had to ask whether the president was an officer of the United States because they were already included in one of these prior 3. So it says he took an oath to support the Constitution. Did he, take an oath to support the Constitution as an officer of the United States? Because that's the only oath he has ever sworn. So, in order for him to be subject to Section 3, he had to have violated the offense element. He had to have done the thing, which we're not dealing with, but he also has to fit within the jurisdictional element, and that's our issue today. And in order for him to fit, he had to have been an officer of the United States as intended or within Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. That is the only way. That is the question. Mike, I have that right here. The Volokh conspiracy. I am reading a paper they referenced in there. All right. Back to the thing. And they go on to talk about the article of impeachment, the articles of impeachment that mentioned the insurrection thing. But he was not found guilty of that. And as is noted correctly in here, that whole issue of whether he was an officer of the United States was completely skirted. In fact, they said any person, which is kind of the common understanding. But Section 3 of the 14th Amendment does not apply to just any person. And here's the impeachment article. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution prohibits any person who has engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States from holding any office under the United States. That's just not true. That's just not true. It's not any person. It's those 4 categories of people. Like, say, for instance, that I went out and incited an insurrection. Nothing in the 14th Amendment prohibits me from holding office because I never swore an oath to thing. I didn't sign shit. Okay. And Trump was not convicted at the Senate trial, by the way, which is a whole other thing. All right. So, is Trump an officer of the United States? And it says here, they do not believe so. It says there's very good reason to think that he doesn't. And it describes how this article is going to proceed. It says Part 1 will contend that the phrases officer of the United States and office under the United States refer to different categories of positions. That's very counterintuitive. But I do think they make a good argument for it. But let's be honest right up front, that is very counterintuitive. They seem like parallel phrases. It says Part 2 will analyze the phrase Officer United States, which is used in the Constitution of 1788 and in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Part 3 will show that the meaning of the phrase Officer United States did not drift from 1788 to 1868, which is when the 14th Amendment was passed. And in both eras, there is substantial evidence that the president was not considered an officer of the United States. Part 4 will recount longstanding executive branch opinions, which affirm that elected officials like the president are not officers of the United States. And then there's some just conclusory statements. Okay, so the first argument is that the phrases officer of the United States and office under the United States in Section 3 refer to different categories of positions. And this is where the Colorado Supreme Court just absolutely disagrees. And this is a big bone of contention. But man, is it counterintuitive that those two phrases refer to different things. I mean, I think we have to honestly say that, no matter where you come down on this. So, they assert that these two phrases have different meanings. And here is where I'm going to really disagree with an assertion they make. Indeed, the very fact that Section 3's text uses both of these phrases and does so in the very same sentence provides substantial evidence that the two phrases do not have identical meanings. Could not disagree more, but this whole sentence now is making me rethink the way I look at bylaws amendments. Everything comes back to bylaws for me, doesn't it? Because Mike will tell you, and anyone who's worked on bylaws with me, and I think in most bylaws committees, we often will say when we're reading a bylaw, we repeat that same phrase twice. That is so awkward. Can we either get rid of it in one part, or can we word it slightly different so we're not repeating words? Well, right here, they're saying if you want to be sure that both times you're referring to the same thing, you should use the exact same phraseology. Well, I can tell you that's not the way writing is done today. The way writing is done today is it's considered bad form to be repetitive with an identical phrase in the exact same sentence. Now, perhaps this is a good example of where in Roberts it says, clarity and unambiguity of meaning is better than, paucity of words or brevity. So perhaps we need to start rethinking the way we're doing bylaws, because I know in the style committee in Colorado, we've been like, oh, that's ugly. We had the exact phrase used twice in the same sentence, but they're literally making the argument here because they didn't use the exact phrase twice in the same sentence. They mean two different things, and I do not think that's a given at all. That could have been a stylistic choice, because to me, an officer of the United States and office under the United States, those seem to be referring to the same thing to me. Now, they're going to make the argument it doesn't, and they will make a strong argument, but this thing they led off with saying because the wording is slightly different, that's strong proof that something different was meant. I do not think that is a strong argument at all, just to be honest here. Because we think the better view is that the jurisdictional element of Section 3 was modeled after the structure and language of the oath or affirmation clause. And I'm tending to agree with them there. Second, we think the better view is that the disqualification element of Section 3, which we're not going to deal with, we're going to mostly deal with the jurisdictional element, they think is modeled after the elector incompatibility clause and the impeachment qualification clause. And goes, third, we think the better view is that the framers imported the meaning the meaning of officer of the United States and office under the United States from the Constitution of 1788 to Section 3. So basically what they are arguing is we need to look to other areas in the Constitution where these words are used, okay, when those two separate phrases are used, and see if it's easier to determine what they mean there, and make a very reasonable presumption that when writing this amendment, that stylistically and definitionally, that the authors were trying to keep in line with what was already in the Constitution. Now, that is a strong argument, that if these two phrases were obviously used differently elsewhere, and in case law, which they get into, that's a much more reasonable argument. Okay. It says first, the jurisdictional, so subpoint A, we should presume that the different types of offices referenced in the same sentence of Section 3 have different meanings. I don't agree there, but I mean, with the way they framed it. It says the jurisdictional element applies to a person who took an oath as an officer of the United States. And it says the disqualification element mandates that disqualification extends to any office under the United States. Had the framers used the same phrase twice in the same sentence, we could reasonably conclude they had the same meaning. This is where I just so highly disagree. It goes, this reasoning follows from the presumption of intra-sentence uniformity. Where the same language is used in the same sentence, we presume the language is used uniformly. Yes, but I don't think the inverse is true. That just because slightly different wording was used, that the presumption is that different meanings were intended. Now, I, though, can steelman this a bit and say, because it's not just the same sentence, it's applying to two different elements, rather than a sentence covering one element, that there maybe you could presume that the difference in wording means a difference in meaning. That, adding that, can make that argument a bit stronger. It says, because Section 3 uses different phrases in the same sentence, the presumption should be the converse. Do not agree, except for, as I said. Oh, it's the Committee of Detail, Mike, was the other committee. It says we can't presume that the various phrases using office and officer were used indiscriminately. There's no record of commensurate efforts by the Committee of Style or the Committee of Detail, whatever that means, to textually align or harmonize the phrases officer of the United States and office under the United States. It says the framers of the 1788 Constitution made many changes to office and officer languages. For example, in the secession clause, the phrase officer of the United States was changed to officer, and the impeachment clause, and this was interesting, the phrase president, vice president, and other civil officers of the U.S. was changed. And in that wording, it would make it clear that the president and vice president were officers, because you can't have other unless you've already named officers, which changed to president, vice president, and civil officers of the United States, which makes it seem in that sentence as if those are different things. Because otherwise, why would you take out the other? And then in its final form, so when it became its final form, it was president, vice president, and all civil officers of the United States. So the framers changed the word that preceded civil officers of the United States from other to all. It says this and other similar alterations show that in the Constitution, the terms office and officer, those differences were significant. Now, that I do think is a compelling argument. However, I don't think it's as strong as they think it is. And everyone could disagree if they want. to say, if it was kept at president, vice president, and civil officers of the United States, I think then it would be very clear that the president and vice president were not officers of the United States. But to change it from president, vice president, and all civil officers, I don't think that necessarily excludes the president and the vice president. I do think naturally that's probably the best reading, but I don't think it's necessarily the only reading. They seem to think it's very, very conclusive here. But it does say the draft Constitution's use of other was in fact rejected in favor of all. I don't know if that's as conclusive as they think it is. Now, here's what I think is an important argument, though I do think that weighs in favor of president and vice president not being officers of the United States. But I don't think it's as conclusive as they think. But it weighs in that direction. What I like what they said here, though, under subsection B, there is some textual overlap between the jurisdictional element of Section 3 and the oath or affirmation clause. And since Section 3 jurisdictional element is dealing with people who have taken oaths, that is a natural place to look. You're not looking at some unrelated portion of the Constitution that like dealt with the post office or something. You're dealing with the oath clause, and this jurisdictional element is talking about people who have taken oaths. So I think it's very natural, logical, and justifiable to go, wait a minute, maybe they borrowed language from the oath and affirmation clause, and I think it did. So he says, we do not think that the language used in Section 3 was drafted from a blank slate, and I agree. I want to go to page 11 of this PDF, because that's where we're at, but just so you know, this is where I'm getting it from, and they compare the oath or affirmation clause, that's from 1788, with the jurisdictional element of Section 3, and show where they believe that the language was borrowed from one to the other. It says both provisions reference the same 4 categories of office holders who swore an oath to support the Constitution. 1, senators and representatives. 2, members of the state legislatures. 3, executive and judicial officers of the United States, and executive and judicial officers of the states. And goes on to note the substantial similarities and how they change. So in the first category, the phrase senators and representatives before mentioned was changed to member of Congress, so that is equivalent. They're not identical, but they're equivalent. And the reason they give, and this is just a bit of really cool history, says that the category of member of Congress is narrower than the category of senators and representatives, because there's like that interregnum period when somebody is a member elect but not yet officially a member, and there's certain things that you can't do as a member, that you must resign from certain, they list it here, but there's certain positions you can't hold when you're a member of Congress, but you can while you're still a member elect before you're officially instantiated into that position. And they argue that's why that language was changed. That's not really relevant to what we're talking about today. So I do think for what we're talking about today, they are pretty equivalent. It says the second category was tweaked from members of the several state legislatures to member of any state legislature. I think that's pretty equivalent, and they speculate that it may be that the phrase any state referred to specific conduct that occurred in only one state rather than it having to span multiple states. The third category was changed, and here's where it gets interesting. From all executive and judicial officers of the United States to an officer of the United States. And then the fourth element was changed from all executive and judicial officers of the several states to an executive or judicial officer of any state. So the language was kind of made a little bit more simple, not quite as fancy pants, but they're very interesting. So he said these third and fourth revisions show the care with which the framers approached the officer language in Section 3. Article 6 of the 1788 Constitution refers broadly to all executive and judicial officers, both of the United States and of the several states. So in a single clause, a bunch of people were looped in. And they say, in our view, it was unnecessary to specify that the officers of the United States had to be executive and judicial officers, because in light of the Appointments Clause, officers of the United States could only be appointed to the executive and judicial branches. So, to put it in more common parlance, it was not necessary to say poodles or dogs, because only dogs can be poodles. While not all dogs are poodles, you have to be at least a dog first before you can be a poodle. To put it in the ways I like to understand things. So he says that this history shows that the framers took some care when drafting the office and officer languages, that these phrases were not used indiscriminately, but there was deliberate effort to modify the current language. Okay, I don't think that yet proved the case. However, going on here, they go on to the impeachment clause, and I don't really want to get to that. I want to get on to point number 2. The phrase officers of the United States is used in 4 provisions of the Constitution of 1788, the Appointments Clause, the Impeachment Clause, the Commissions Clause, and the Oath or Affirmation Clause. It says, in our view, the President is not an officer of the United States for purposes of any of these 4 times it is mentioned. In the Appointments Clause, it's spelled out with clarity that the President can nominate ambassadors, other public ministers, consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States. Now, I think it's crystal clear in the Appointments Clause that the President is not an officer of the United States, because there the word other was retained, and he, she can appoint all other officers of the United States. Obviously cannot appoint themselves. So in that, I think that is pretty clear. And then it says the Commissions Clause provides that all the officers of the United States receive presidential commissions. And as they said, all means all. The President doesn't receive a presidential commission. The President gives the presidential commission. So it's very clear in the Appointments Clause and in the Commissions Clause, 2 out of the 4 so far, that officers of the United States in those 2 clauses does not include the President. And then in the Impeachment Clause, it says the President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment. I don't think that one is as crystal clear, though it weighs in favor of the fact that they are not officers of the United States. And in light of the other 2, I think that makes it pretty stronger. Because in the Appointments and Commissions Clause, I don't think there's any question at all about that. So if you look at the Appointments and the Commissions Clause, I do think you have to come to the conclusion that no elected officials are officers of the United States. It's very counterintuitive to us today. And I think I'm coming at it from the prejudice of just like my experience with the LP and being I hold an office of the Libertarian Party. I am an officer and I was elected, so maybe that really colored my understanding of this whole document. But if you look at the appointments clause and the commissions clause, definitely in those two clauses, the president is not an officer of the United States. So are we going to assume in it was 18 in the 14th Amendment, I forgot the year it was written again, was it 18, whatever, y'all will let me know, me and numbers, that they were going to directly contradict earlier language. That makes things super, super confusing, doesn't it? And it says our position is consistent with recent Supreme Court precedent, where Chief Justice Roberts observed that the people do not vote for the officers of the United States, rather they are appointed. It follows from these premises that the president, who is an elected official, is not an officer of the United States. And it says, we think Section 3's officer of the United States language was imported from the Oath or Affirmation Clause. I think that's very reasonable. By using this phrasing, the framers of Section 3 likely intended to import or adopt the settled meanings from that provision, whether or not they had given concrete thought to what that meaning was. And that also is a potentiality here. Remember, the Constitution, despite what some conservatives might want you to believe, is not wholly inerrant scripture delivered from on high. And I love this sentence. I don't know what it did come from a court case. Like, this is just so judgy. I don't mean judgy in the bad way. Like, you just know a judge wrote this. I love this. When a word is obviously transplanted from another legal source, whether the common law or other legislation, it brings the old soil with it. That is just so poetic. I love that. I just really, really love that. And it says here, Section 3's jurisdictional element was quite obviously modeled on the Oath or Affirmation Clause, which was written in the same time period as the Appointment Clause and the Commission Clause, in which it is absolutely, utterly clear that officer of the United States does not include the president. So they say the soil was transplanted along with the tree's roots and branches. The president is not expressly listed in the Oath or Affirmation Clause. Why? Because they do a different kind of oath. Okay. So in 1788, the president was not an officer of the United States, according to their conclusion. And we contend that the phrase officer of the United States has the same meaning in Section 3 as it does in the Constitution of 1788. The elected president is not an officer of the United States. And now they're getting to the next element. Did the meaning of words drift between 1788 and 1868? And he says we've seen no substantial evidence that that meaning had some kind of semantic shift. So, critics argue that there was. In other words, they say there was some linguistic drift or slippage between the 1788 ratification of the Constitution and the 1868 ratification of the 14th Amendment. Now, we should be able to understand this today because we get in these arguments a lot over the Second Amendment, don't we? The word regulated does not mean the same thing today, or not at least in its primary connotation when you're looking at laws as it meant in the time the Second Amendment was written. There was definitely some semantic shift because you will see anti-gun people all the time going, oh, you can have all these gun laws because it's a well-regulated militia. So, between 1788 and 1868, it's almost 100 years. There certainly could have been a semantic drift. It says, so let's assume the president is not an officer of the United States for purposes of the 1788 Constitution. Under that assumption, it's still possible that the president could be an officer of the United States for purposes of Section 3. And they also say it would hardly be surprising that in the post-bellum epoch, new meanings might have accrued to older language. But they don't believe it happened, and says that you need some pretty strong contrary evidence to say that the clear meaning of a term in other areas of the Constitution means something completely different, and would be so sloppy of the framers in order to have some kind of just coherence. He goes, you need to presume linguistic continuity when someone is purposely sitting down to write this document. And now they go through some case law. United States versus, never going to pronounce this, MOAT, 1888, strongly suggested that officers are appointed, not elected. United States versus Hartwell, 1867, strongly suggested the same thing. And there are other contemporary sources that said the president was not an officer of the United States, and these were in 1788 and 1868, kind of showing that there really wasn't a semantic drift in the language. It says United States versus MOAT rebuts arguments in favor of linguistic drift. And you can, maybe we'll end up reading that case. Again, it's not dealing, obviously, with this section, but it is dealing with the appointments clause, which is relevant to what we just talked about. So it says, in short, MOAT makes the linguistic drift view very difficult to defend. For this argument to work, the meaning of office of the United States must have drifted back and forth. In 1788, the phrase did not include the presidency. In 1868, the phrase did include the presidency. But during the 5-year span between 1868 and 1873, the meaning of that phrase drifted back such that the president was not an officer of the United States. We find that proposed chronology implausible. I would find it impossible. I think they were being too kind in saying that they found it implausible. And in the Hartwell case, it says an officer is conferred by appointment. Presidents are not appointed, they are elected. Okay. And then they go on to other contemporary sources. So let's see if there is anything else, because they repeat themselves a lot here. It's a law journal. That's what you do in law journals. This is where they get paid by the word. They deal with an argument here that the Colorado Supreme Court relies heavily upon. And that is, and we'll read their decision here. And it was a statement that I at first found persuasive, that how could it possibly be, in light of the Civil War, that this section meant to exclude everybody but the highest office? How is that even rational? Again, maybe they screwed up. So this argument is dealt with a bit here. He's by someone named Maglioka. Congress did not intend, nor would the public have understood, that Jefferson Davis could not be a representative or a senator, but could be president. And it says in 2009, someone made that same argument, but these intuitions would also concern the scope of Section 3's disqualification element. These intuitions do not squarely resolve the issue of whether a president was an officer of the United States for its jurisdictional element. And they go on and said, let the people and not partisan state election boards decide who can be the next president. I would agree with that. Just flipping through here a little bit again, but I think out of this little treatise here that I covered everything that I wanted to. Oh no, there's some here at the end. They do concede in everyday parlance, which is what I was basing my opinion on. The president is an officer of the United States. But that type of argument can't establish the precise meaning of a phrase used in the Constitution. So they acknowledge there is a purposivist, I've never heard that word before, argument supporting the view that the president is an officer of the United States with respect to that jurisdictional element. And here is, they're going to say what a couple years later the Colorado Supreme Court relied upon. Of course, it wasn't quoting them, but this is the argument. Could it really be, the argument goes, that virtually every elected and appointed position in the federal and state governments would be encompassed by Section 3's jurisdictional element, but not the presidency? After all, a former president of the United States, John Tyler, was actually elected to the Confederate Congress. Would the framers really have exempted Tyler or men like him from disqualification? Professor Maglioka, citing the Tyler hypothetical, suggested that the idea of an insurrectionist president was real, not a far-fetched hypothetical, and John Breckinridge, who had served as vice president of the United States under President Buchanan, later served as a general in the Confederate Army. But they go on to say there's a pragmatic rationale that explains why the presidency was excluded. By the time the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, there were no living former presidents that had supported the Confederacy. So it wasn't a real concern. So to say, would they really have wanted these Confederates to be able to be president? Well, it wasn't a real concern then. Before that time, it might have been, but by the time this was ratified, those people were dead. Tyler died in 1862. And if had Tyler still been alive, he would have unquestionably been covered anyway, because he previously had served as a senator from Virginia, which is usually how it works. Trump is the one oddball that wouldn't be covered by those former three categories. And here is a really great statement, because that asshole, and I don't mind saying that, what's his name? Ilya Somin, who from Cato, I don't know if he's still with Cato, that supported vaccine mandates, was like, blah, blah, blah. You're not deprived of life, liberty, or property by being denied the right to run for president, so you don't have to have all of these like existential concerns. Now I am paraphrasing, but basically he downplayed the due process requirement here by saying you're not really being deprived of anything. And I just was like, that guy, remember, he supported vaccine mandates. But they address that idea here. It says, we think the democracy canon provides support for our position. Professor Richard L. Hasen explains that under this canon, a provision of the Constitution that might be read to limit the citizen in his exercise of the right of suffrage should be liberally construed in his favor. And then they go on to say, this presumption equally applies to the political candidate who wishes to run for an elected position. Given two reasonable readings of the phrase officer of the United States in Section 3, the democracy canon favors the reading that expands democratic choice. While not a fan of democracy, while we're under it, I do agree with this interpretation here. And also, they point out something else really, really interesting. Section 3's jurisdictional element is not a catch-all. It does not cover all state and federal positions. There are gaps in coverage. For example, The jurisdictional element extends to a member of any state legislature, as well as an executive or judicial officer of any state, but it does not extend to appointed positions in state legislatures. For examples, clerks and secretaries of state legislatures who later served in the Confederate government could not be subject to disqualification. So this idea like, oh my God, they wouldn't have any gaps. Now, I know there's a big difference of having a gap in the highest office, but still, there were gaps. And it says Section 3 as a whole has other glaring omissions. Disqualified persons could still serve on state or federal juries, serve as elected territorial officers, serve as enlisted federal military or state militia personnel, participate as national or state convention members under Article 5, and many other such positions. Section 3's jurisdictional and disqualification elements did not universally apply to every person who had supported the Confederacy, which some people seem to assume was the intent. But that obviously was not the intent. Now, they say how the Supreme Court, they look to the future, and the future is now, because remember this was written a few years ago, that in the case they anticipated that the sorts of challenges and decisions, such as the one that Colorado made, would happen, and then it would go to the Supreme Court, and that's what we're seeing happening. So they give the Supreme Court, or I mean everyone can see this, but they're like, the Supreme Court really has an out with this, in that they never even have to determine was January 6th an insurrection. Because again, if it doesn't meet the jurisdictional requirement, none of the other stuff matters. And that's why I'm concentrating on that. So, if the Supreme Court agrees with us and concludes that the president is not an officer of the United States, then the case is over. Election boards, I don't think they were really determining court cases. They thought this would be done by election boards, but it doesn't matter. That deemed Trump disqualified would be reversed. Trump could be listed on the ballot. The people and not partisan election boards or partisan Colorado Supreme Court leftist judges could select the next president. Perhaps, excuse me. Perhaps the Supreme Court could leapfrog the offense element and jump right to the disqualification element. If the presidency is not in office under the United States, then Trump could not be disqualified from the presidency. He goes, in this article, we've made the case that they're not an officer, but we've been very careful to avoid resolving the scope of the phrase office under the United States. Suffice it to say, in light of the possibility of linguistic drift, which I don't think there's a possibility, we think this issue is contestable, and in the end, the Supreme Court would decide. So, a narrow finding that the president is not an officer of the United States ends the case. And if this goes to the Supreme Court, I would not be surprised if that's where they go, and avoid the bramble bush altogether as to whether or not January 6th was an insurrection. So let's look a little bit as to what the Colorado Supreme Court did say. So on page 79 of the 214-page decision plus dissent, they have their little subparagraph here. The president is an officer of the United States. So they came down on the complete opposite side. They go under the plain meaning of office under the United States. So they're saying that the two phrases are equivalent rather than them meaning different things, which is contrary to what they argued. So they're going to the disqualification provision of office under the United States and basically claiming it is equivalent to officer of the United States. It says, the plain meaning of office under the United States includes the presidency, so it follows then that the president is an officer of the United States. And I originally had agreed with that. And they point to a lot of informality of uses over the years. Yeah, don't find that persuasive. But they said the structure of Section 3. But so they're looking at the structure of Section 3 without looking at how Section 3 could be modeled after the structure of other sections. Persuades us that the president is an officer of the United States. The first half of Section 3 describes the offices protected, and the second half addresses the parties barred from holding those protected offices. There is a parallel structure between the two halves. Senator or representative in Congress, quote, paren, protected office, close paren, corresponds to a member of Congress, which is the barred party. Any office under the United States, open paren, protected office, close paren, corresponds to officer of the United States, open paren, barred party, close paren. And as you can see, they do parallelism. I don't think that's unreasonable in isolation. But I do think the in isolation is the problem here. So that is the crux of their argument, is that you have to see Section 3 as being written in parallel. Now, if I were looking at it, again, in strict isolation and the way that I tend to prefer bylaws written, I would agree with what they said, that there's a reason why, that there's a stylistic reason not to pedantically repeat phrases. But perhaps that's not the best way, now that this case really may have revolutionized my view on how to write these things, and rather than being obsessed with repetition of words as being ugly. Now, I haven't done a word search yet through this Supreme Court decision, which I need to do, to see if they deal with the issue of the Appointments Clause or the Commissions Clause, because I do want to see if they deal with that, because so far, that to me is shifting the argument in favor of the idea that the president is not an officer of the United States. I'd like to very fairly examine how the Colorado Supreme Court got around that, or if they dealt with that issue at all, because I have not read the entire 214 pages. I'm going to do a word search to see if those were dealt with, and if so, we will do that in another show. I'm going to give this a few minutes to see if there's any comments. This was somewhat technical, and I have to say, I felt really stupid reading a lot of this. I think it almost went a bit over my head. It was quite complex. Then, of course, my black anarchist heart was just, I don't want to spend all of Christmas Eve in the Constitution. But here we go. God has a sense of humor. Oh, Mike, look what I have. Love it. And Mike said they don't address either the appointments or the commission clauses in the majority opinion. That's a big failure. You can't just point to parallelism in the 14th Amendment, Section 3, without dealing with that identical phrase appearing elsewhere unambiguously in sections where it does not include the president. So I am super excited, which is a weird way to put it, to read, because this is going to the Supreme Court. And though some people are having wet dreams over going, wouldn't it be funny if cert was denied? Cert is not going to be denied. They will be the biggest cowards on the planet. And should be made birds again if cert is denied. Cert is not going to be denied. So I am really, really interested in what the Supreme Court's going to come out with this. Doesn't mean I'm going to agree. I've read a lot of really crappy Supreme Court decisions, but it doesn't mean I'm not going to be interested, and we will definitely go over it. Now I'm going to start to read some other people's opinions and listen to Dave Smith show and other shows, and maybe then do some updates. But I can tell you now, after going through all of this with you, I'm not going to say firmly. Can we say softly firmly? What is it with the porridge? Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Like, the porridge is mostly hot. So now I'm mixing the Princess Bride in. So if I had to say right now what my position is, though I can't say it's strongly my position, if I had to say my position, it would be that right now that the president is not an officer of the United States under the 14th Amendment, Section 3. That would be my persuadable position, but that's my position right now. So we'll see if other people persuade me. But I don't think the Colorado Supreme Court was completely out of its tree in noting the parallelism in that section. But if in fact, which I'll double check, Mike, that they didn't deal with the appointments or commissions clauses, that's fatal to me. And I think that's where the Supreme Court is going to go. Where's Chuck Moulton? We could take some bets on this. Yes, very warm. So Mike Seebeck, he condensed all of my jumble of words. Yeah, I'm very warm on it, but not hot. My mind could be changed. And boy, people get explosive over this. Like, I've been attacked left and right on Twitter for just like even saying, well, I don't know, maybe on that point, the Colorado Supreme Court had a point. Listen, I don't have to like left-leaning judges. I don't have my new gavel down here. I'll bring it to the next one. I have an old gavel down here, but I don't have a new one down here dealing with comments. We don't have to like leftist judges. I don't like extreme right-wing judges either. But come on, these people on the court did not get there because they're idiots. They are smart legal minds. I know some people might disagree, but in general, you know, unless we're dealing with strict diversity hires, which is kind of a modern phenomena, these are learned lawyers. You might not like lawyers, but they're not so stupid that they walk into walls face first. You don't have to agree with their opinion, but I do think you should give it the respect of the time they put into it to at least acknowledge that it's just not completely stupid. And I know some big-time Trump supporters would just like to say, oh, the Colorado Supreme Court is just a bunch of dumbasses. And I don't think that's doing the issue justice. You can think they're, and pun intended, you're not doing the justices justice. You can disagree with them without, you know, making them into morons, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Okay, God, I'm really froggy tonight. Well, I hope you have an awesome Christmas Eve, and perhaps there'll be a show tomorrow. It depends on what plans I have with Wayne tomorrow. Not even sure what it will be. We might go over the delegation chairs manual, or maybe some more on this topic. Again, niche content. If you enjoyed it, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/Pink Flame of Liberty. Okay, that is enough. I'm going to go now. Bye-bye.
Given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians, or choose to be an accountant because it's safe in the business, not because they want